Welcome everyone to the 2GIG Technologies Go Control technical training. My name is Andrew Curtis. I'm the Director of Customer Support here, and I do the technical trainings as well. We're going to go through, we'll cover a couple things. We're going to go over the hardware, we'll go over programming, and then at the end we'll go over some of the Z-Wave as well. But with the hardware, we're going to go over system capabilities, kind of what's inside the panel, what's inside the box, the transformer. We'll talk about the terminal block and the GSM module. If you've been through one of these before, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome. And if you guys have questions, just let me know. And we will try and answer those questions as we go. But with system capabilities, you've got 48 wireless zones. In addition to those 48 wireless zones, you have 2 hardwired zones, up to 8 key fobs, up to 4 secondary keypads. And for communication, you can do two-way over a GSM module, which is how it's defaulted. You can do two-way over a POTS line if you're just using a phone line. And as a Z-Wave controller, it can hold up to 232 Z-Wave devices. I don't think I've ever seen it hold or been in a house that's had more than 30. But in total, you can have a lot of different devices on the panel. When you open up the panel, a couple things. First is this third hand. Basically, it's just a strap to help hold the panel on the wall while you're plugging different things into it. Next is the RJ45 connector. That is where you would plug your POTS line or your phone line into. You've got a 24-hour backup battery that is rechargeable, so if the power goes out and it drains the battery, it'll come on and it'll recharge itself. The 345 megahertz RF receiver, so it communicates on the 345 frequency, and that's important because that's the same frequency as the 5800 series equipment from Ademco. So you're able to, say you go into a house that has some existing equipment, if it's some existing Ademco equipment, you're able to use those devices. The terminal block, as you can see in the picture, the terminal block is labeled. That way you know where everything will go. The GSM antenna compartment, there's 3 different types of GSM antennas. There's this internal antenna that you see here. There's also a 2-foot antenna and a 10-foot antenna. So just kind of depending on the situation, you might want to use one over the other. And then the GSM module itself is a pop-in style GSM, and there will be a little black connector that you'll see that it'll just plug into. And then you've got your 85 decibel siren, and that is the inside of the panel. It's a self-contained unit, so everything is just right here. With the transformer, it's a 14-volt DC 1.7 amp transformer. So just make sure you're paying attention to the polarity. You got your positive and your negative. And then with the terminal block, terminals 1 and 2 are your power. So 1's your positive, 2's your negative. Terminals 3 and 4 are your open collector. An open collector is just a programmable output. It's 250 milliamps at 16 volt DC, and a lot of times people will use that for sirens and strobe lights, or even triggering a relay to open and close the garage door. Terminals 5 and 6 are an external bell output, and the bell output's a little bit different. It's automatically programmed, and it's 120 milliamps in between 6 and 12 volt DC. So typically, if you're going to hook up a little piezo siren, you would want to just wire it into terminals 5 and 6. And then terminals 7 and 8 are your two hardwired zones. So your positive or your high wire from your hardwired zones would go on terminal 7 and 8, and then your low or your common would go into your ground on terminal number 3. Going back to the GSM module, you've got the antenna port, and with the antenna port you'll want to just make sure it snaps on all the way. You should feel it click on there. You've got your mounting or grounding screws, so make sure you've got those on there. And then the last thing is the serial number. So when you register it with Alarm.com, whether it's over the phone or on their dealer site, they're going to ask for a serial number, this IMEI number. And it's just a 10-digit, looks like a phone number, but that's the number that you would use. And that is it for hardware, so pretty simple. With programming, all the programming is done inside what we call the installer toolbox. And there's a couple things in there. The first thing is system configuration. This is where you would program a zone or a key fob or a keypad. Also, all of your system settings are in there. Also in the installer toolbox, you have a radio status, a system restore, a walk test, and a disable sounder. And we'll go over all of those. That way you guys, we can make sure everybody understands that. But first is how to get to the installer toolbox. And to get to the installer toolbox from the home screen, you're going to press Security, Menu, and then Toolbox. And this will actually take you inside of the user toolbox where the homeowner or the customer can come in here. They can add user codes. They can change the brightness or volume. They can edit their chime settings. If they scroll to the right twice, there will be a button labeled Installer Toolbox. And they'll click on the Installer Toolbox, or actually you guys will click on the Installer Toolbox. And it's going to ask you for your installer code. Now by default it's 1561, but every dealer changes that. Everybody has their own installer code. So type in the installer code, and that'll take you inside of the installer toolbox. And you can see all the different little things. But we're going to start with system configuration. Now system configuration is broken down into a series of questions. Each question does something different. Question number 1 is your wireless zones. And within question 1, you have up to 48 zones that you can program, and each of those zones have sub-questions. Question number 2, similarly, is your hardwired zones that you would program with sub-questions. Same thing with question 3, which is your key fobs, and question 4, which is your wireless keypads. And then questions 5 through 86 are all of your different system settings or field questions. So it's kind of like zone programming is questions 1 through 4, and field programming is questions 5 through 86. The easy way to navigate is to press the Go To button, followed by the 2-digit question number. So let's, for example, say you wanted to change your installer code. You would just press go to and then 43, and it would take you to your installer code question where you could just type in a new 4-digit number, and that would become your installer code. With questions 1 through 4, you'll use the up and down arrows to move back and forth between the different sub-questions. Each of the zones has different sub-questions that you'll program for those zones. And then the left and right arrows you will use to program or select the different options for each sub-question. And then the same thing with questions 5 through 86, you'll use the up and down arrows just to move back and forth, and then the left and right arrows to scroll through your options. So it's really simple. We're going to walk through how to program a zone. That way you guys can see how easy it is. So the first thing, in the dark blue box at the top, you'll see it says Q1, select RF sensor number. So that's how you know where you're at in programming. You can look there and it'll tell you exactly where you're at. So now we know we're on question number 1, which is all of our wireless RF sensors. And then in the white box it shows 01 in parentheses, and that's our zone number. The first thing that we're going to want to do is press the down arrow, and it'll take us to our first sub-question, which is our sensor type or our zone type. Now the sensor type basically determines how and when the control panel is going to respond to a signal from that sensor. So for example, if it's an exit entry, it's going to have a little bit of a delay on it, versus if it's a perimeter, it'll be instant. So what you can do is you can use the left and right arrows to scroll through the different options, the different sensor types, and select what you want. Also, the sensor types have a 2-digit number, and on the quick programming guide or in the installation manual, there will be a list that has all of these sensor types and their numbers. So you can just find the number. Say it was our front door, we would just press 01 and it would put exit entry 1 for us. So once you've selected what you want for your zone type, go ahead and hit the down arrow. The next sub question is our equipment code, and the equipment code is our model number. That way the panel knows what piece of equipment we're using. Now just like our zone type, we can scroll left or right with the arrows and select the piece of equipment we want, or there's a big long list of all the different pieces of equipment that we know work with our panel, and each one has a 4-digit number, and so you could just type in that 4-digit number. The next sub question is our serial number. And so each of these peripherals is going to have a 7-digit serial number assigned to it. And you can either manually type in the serial number, or you can do an auto entry mode by pressing shift and then learn, and then triggering that sensor. And when you trigger that sensor, it'll place the serial number automatically for you, and you can hit the down arrow, and it'll move you on to your next sub question, which is your equipment age. The equipment age is the one that doesn't really affect the usability of that zone. It's just there to, kind of keep track of what new pieces of equipment have been used. And Alarm.com tracks it. The central station will track it, and you guys can use it for inventory. So your options are either a new piece of equipment or an existing piece of equipment. So if it was something that was already in the house, you'd use existing. If you hit the down arrow, your next sub question is your loop number, and then the loop number by default will be a 1. Really, there's only one time that it'll ever be different, and that's on your door window contacts. The door window contacts have 2 inputs. it'll either be a loop 1 or a loop 2. A loop 1 is if you're using the external, normally closed hardwired lead. And then a loop 2 is an internal magnetic contact. So if it's just a sensor with a magnet, it'll be a loop 2. When you do the auto entry mode with your serial number, it'll automatically know where it pulled the serial number from, and it'll change your loop number for you. So you'll just want to make sure that it's right, just in case something happened, but just make sure that your loop number's right, and then you can hit the down arrow and move on. Next, you've got the dialer delay. By default, there's a 30-second abort window where, in case of a false alarm, you can disarm your alarm system, and within the first 30 seconds, it'll send a cancellation. If you want that on, you can leave it on. It's on by default. But if you don't want it on, then you can disable it here. Next is the voice descriptor. And the voice descriptor is what the control panel will announce during a chime. It also gets uploaded to Alarm.com and the central station. And if you look on the installer guide or the quick programming guide, there's a vocabulary table of 255 words. Each of those words has a 3-digit index number assigned to it. So what you're going to do is, for each word, you'll press insert followed by the 3-digit number. So for example, let's say we want to program the words front door. You'll press insert followed by 098 for front, and then insert 058 for door. So for each word, you would follow that process. You can have up to 5 words for each zone. And also, if you aren't quite sure what the 3-digit number is, it's listed alphabetically as well as numerically. So you could just press insert 100, and it would take you into the general area of the word front, and then you could just use the left or right arrows to kind of scroll through until you found the exact word that you wanted to use. Once your voice descriptor is set, you can hit the down arrow. Your next sub-question is whether or not the sensor reports to the central station. By default, it's set to report to a central station, so you can just leave that and hit the down arrow and move to the next sub-question. The next sub-question is the supervision for that zone. Whether or not the panel is going to receive regularly timed supervisory signals. If you want that disabled, you can disable it, and there will be times where you will. If it's a panic button, you don't want it to be supervised in case the homeowner leaves the house. We don't want to start getting signals because they went to the grocery store. So select whether or not it's supervised, but by default it'll be enabled. And then the last setting is the chime setting. And the chime is something that the customer can actually program on their own, but since you're already in programming, it's just as easy for you to set it real quick. There are a couple different options for you to pick from, so just look through that list and pick one of the chime settings. And then when you're done and you hit the down arrow, it'll take you to a summary screen. So I know it seemed like a lot that we just programmed, but if you look at the list, it breaks it down really simple. We've got our zone type, our equipment code, our serial number, the equipment age, the loop number, dialer delay, voice descriptor, reporting, and chime is at the bottom. So it lists everything that we just programmed. And a couple things. If you hit the Edit Current button, it'll take you back to the beginning of that zone, and then at that point you could scroll through again and make any changes that you needed to. If everything looks correct, then you can press Edit Next and it'll take you to the next zone. And then you would repeat that process for zone number 2 or zone number 3. The Skip button will take you to the next question, which would be question 2 or our hardwired zones. So let's go ahead and press Skip, and it's going to take us to question 2. Now the programming for the hardwired zones is pretty similar to our wireless zones, so we can cruise through here, and just for general knowledge, the 2 hardwired zones report as sensors number 49 and 50. So just kind of going in numerical order, we've got the 48 wireless zones, and we got 49 and 50 are the 2 hardwired zones. They cannot be used for carbons or smoke detectors. And so the first thing you'll want to do is press the down arrow, just like the other zones. The first prompt will be your sensor type. So just go through and select your sensor type. And you'll notice on here that it doesn't even allow you to pick fire or carbon monoxide as a sensor type. So, but you can pick all your others. Your next sub-question will be the equipment code. Because you're not using any piece of equipment, it's a hardwired zone. Just leave it as a 0 and skip over that. Your next sub-question is the equipment age. Again, it doesn't really matter. It won't affect how that zone works. So you could leave it as new. You could change it to existing. Okay, a new screen, it's a little different than the wireless zones, is the normal state. Instead of asking for a serial number, you basically just tell it if it's normally open, normally closed, or end-of-line resistor. Each zone, you'll be able to change the dialer delay. Again, that's that 30-second abort window. So if it's a false alarm and you disarm it within the first 30 seconds, it'll send that cancellation. Then you've got your voice descriptor, and again, you can have up to 5 words, and you just press insert followed by that 3-digit number for each word. Next is your reporting. So by default, it'll be enabled again, but if it's a sensor that you do not want it to report to a central station, then you would disable it. And then the last one is your chime. And just the same thing, you'll select what type of chime you want. And then it'll take you to your summary screen. And you can just kind of review it again. If you notice something is wrong, hit Edit Current. If you're ready to do either your next zone, you could hit Edit Next, or move on to question number 3. You would press Skip. With question number 3, there are a couple different screens, so we'll go over this. And the key fobs will report the next numerical numbers are going to be 51 through 58. Your first screen, and this always tends to cause a few questions just because of how it's worded, but it says select fob number used, so select fob 1 used, and your options are either used or unused. And basically it's asking is it enabled or disabled or on or off. And so make sure you select used. That way the control panel will know that you're using a key fob zone. Okay, the next sub question is your equipment code. So you'll just go through and you'll select the 2 gig key fob. And then you've got your serial number. And again, you can either just type it in or you can do the auto entry. And when you do the auto entry on the key fob, you'll press the shift and learn button like always. But you just press a button on the key fob and it doesn't matter which button you press. It could be any of them. And then it'll place the serial number for you. Your panic button or your emergency key is the top 2 buttons at the same time. So you've got the top left, top right, or your arm and disarm buttons. Both of those buttons at the same time will trigger an emergency alarm. And with programming, by default it's disabled. But if the customer wants the key fob to have a panic button on it, then you would just select what type of panic you want it to send. So either an auxiliary or a medical, an audible police, a silent police, or a fire. Next, you can program it so that that key fob can disarm the panel. Every now and then, not very often, but every now and then, the customer will use it as a stationary wall fob or leave it on their nightstand, and they'll want it to be able to arm the system but not disarm the system, just in case somebody ever does break in. That way they don't have easy access to disarming the system. If that's ever the case, then you could enable or disable this prompt or sub-question, but most of the time, if they're going to be using a key fob for the remote access, they'll want to be able to arm it and disarm it. So by default, it's enabled. Then you've got your voice descriptor. And the voice descriptor, by default, it just gets labeled as key fob and then the number. So key fob 1, key fob 2, 3, 4, or whatever. With the voice descriptor, once it's uploaded to alarm.com, you can actually go in and rename it, and you can just type in somebody's name. That way, when that key fob is used to arm or disarm the panel, and if you've got it set up for notifications, it'll actually, instead of saying key fob 1 disarm the panel, it'll say, mom or dad disarm the panel, or somebody specific disarm the panel. You also have the ability to program the key fob to arm it in an instant mode. You can also do this from the control panel itself on the arming screen, but this makes it a little bit more simple when you're using the key fob. It would arm it in an instant mode every time with your key fob. Some people like it, other people don't, but that's why it's there as an option. And then the last one is the output button, or that star button on the key fob. And that is what you would use to trigger the control panel's open collector. So let's say, for example, you have your your garage door or a relay wired into that open collector output. You can program it so that the key fob star button will trigger that relay and open and close. So if you had it set as a momentary output, it would just trigger, it would open your garage door, and then the next time you push it, it would trigger again and it would close your garage door. So if somebody wants to do that, you can, but by default it's disabled. And then again, the last thing, just like everything else, you've got your summary screen that you can check. If we press skip, it'll take us to question 4, which are our keypads. And you can have up to 4 keypads, and the last 4 zones are 59 through 62. And just like the key fobs, the first sub-question is a little confusing. You know, is the keypad being used or is it unused? And make sure that you select used. That way the control panel will know that it needs to talk to a keypad. Next, you've got the equipment code, and you have 2 options. You can either use the numeric button keypad, or you can do the touchscreen secondary keypad. And depending on what you select for the equipment code will affect what your next screen is. If you select the pad 1 or that numeric button keypad, because it's a 345 device, it'll have a serial number associated with it. And so you'll go in and you'll program that serial number. If you're doing a TS1, the TS1 is a 900 megahertz device, and it does not have a serial number. Instead, it goes through a learning process, and so on the control panel there will be a learn button, and you'll just press that learn button and it'll start looking for a signal. Then on the TS1 there will be a button labeled pair with panel that you'll press, and then the 2 panels will start talking to each other. Now, just as a disclaimer, when you're installing a TS1, because it's on the 900 megahertz, you need to replace the RF receiver that's on that panel. I don't know if you guys remember, but back at the beginning, going over the panel, there was that little rectangular silver RF receiver module. When you get the TS1, you can get it in a kit, and that kit includes the 900 megahertz transceiver, which will do both the 345 megahertz frequency and the 900 megahertz frequency. And so you'll want to power down your panel, pull out the 345 receiver, plug in that 900 megahertz transceiver, and then power your panel back up. Once you've done that, then you can go through this learn process. That way the panel can talk to the TS1 secondary panel. And then once they learn together, they basically become slave panels of each other. You know, whatever's displayed on one, you know, whatever you can do on one, you can do on the other. So you've got full functionality. You can control your Z-Wave devices. You can arm, you can disarm. You get the day, time, and weather. So all that good stuff. And that is it for the keypads. When you're done with the keypads, if you press the skip button, it'll take you to question 5. And there are a couple settings that you may or may not need to change. So we're going to go over a couple of these important questions. Question number 8 is your dialer. So if you're ever using a POTS line, you need to enable your dialer. By default, it's disabled. So again, if you ever have a phone line hooked up to it, make sure you enable question number 8. Question number 11 is your central station phone number. You only need to program this if you're using a phone line. Same thing with question number 12. This is your account number. Both of those only are if you're using a phone line. And then question 63 is if you're using a phone line as a primary, but the customer wants the Alarm.com features, and so they have the GSM as a backup. Question 43 is your installer code, so you can go in and change that. Question 44 allows you to lock out the programming. And my caution on this is just to be careful, because if you enable it, it'll start a 48-hour timer. And after that 48 hours, you are unable to get back into programming unless you go in remotely through Alarm.com. So it does give you options as far as how much access you have. You can either block all access to programming, or you can have limited access, kind of like a read-only. But again, if you've been locked out, you need to go in remotely through Alarm.com to and upload the panel and unlock it that way. And then question 79 is your Z-Wave features. There's a couple questions with Z-Wave. That's just the beginning, and we're going to go over all that here in a second. Going back to the installer toolbox, we've got the radio status button. The radio status button will either be red, yellow, or green, and if it's red, typically that either means that there's no cell signal or the GSM module is not registered. So when people call into tech support, what we do is we'll have them check the antenna to make sure the antenna is plugged in all the way, make sure that the GSM module is screwed in with the mounting screws and plugged in all the way. You could power cycle it, make sure it's connecting to a tower. But if it's staying red and it's not registering, then you'll want to call Alarm.com and have them check the serial number, make sure everything is registered correctly. If you click on it, it'll pull up all of your radio status. It'll show you your signal strength. It'll show you your serial number, registration status. At a minimum, your signal strength needs to be a 6, but obviously the higher the signal strength, the better. Next is the Restore Defaults button, and if you ever need to default the panel, the nice thing is that you're able to pick what you default. If you want to default all of your zones and save your system settings, you can. Or say you have 30 zones that you want to save, but you want to default your system settings. So you can check or uncheck whatever you want to default. Walk test is just a local test. It'll list all of your zones, and you can go through and trigger all those, and it will turn green, and it'll show you a signal strength for that sensor. It does not send a signal to your central station. It's just local on the panel, but that's the walk test. And then the last one is the disable sounder, and the disable sounder is nice. I'm sure we've all done it. I know I've done it a ton of times, where I've been working on an existing a hardwired system, and I've unplugged the siren so I could test everything, and then I've forgotten to plug the siren back in before I've left the house. This disable sounder button allows you to automatically disable the siren for 30 minutes. And then at the end of that 30 minutes, it'll automatically re-enable itself. That way you don't have to unplug anything. It's all just electronic. So that is a nice feature to have. Next, we're going to talk about the takeover module real quick. We do get a lot of questions about it. So we'll go over this real quick. And the takeover module is a device that allows you to go into a house with an existing system, hardwired system, and you can take 8 hardwired zones, plug them into this module, and it'll convert those into 8 wireless zones that you could then program into the panel. Each of those zones would be individual zones on the panel, and so we'll show you how to program that. You can stack up to 6 takeover modules on a Go Control panel to get your 48 zones. And when you open it, this is what it looks like. You've got a G port for your common grounds or your low wires. You've got a 12 volt DC positive that you would pull either from your auxiliary output on your existing system or a separate power supply. And then you've got terminals 1 through 8, which are for all your high wires or your positives from your zones. Now there's a couple different ways that you can wire the takeover module, just kind of depending on the situation. This is one example of a house that has an existing Vista 15. So in this example, I'm just going to use the Vista to reroute my power. There are other ways to do it where you can use separate power supplies, but either way, it's important that things are done in a specific order. If it's not powered up, if the takeover module, let me clarify, if the takeover module is not powered up in a specific order, the control panel will show a low battery signal on all of those zones. And that's probably one of the more commonly asked questions that we get is, you know, I've got this hardwired zone, but it says low battery. Why? And 99.9% of the time it's going to be that you just need to power cycle that takeover module and make sure the battery is plugged in first. But hooking up the takeover module, what you're going to do is on your existing system, you're going to unplug the power and you're going to unplug the backup battery so everything's completely down. Then you'll take your high wires and you're going to plug those into your takeover module. Then you'll plug in your backup battery, and you'll run a wire to plug in your auxiliary or your DC power. Then with your low wires, what I do just for time and convenience is I leave them on the existing system where they're at. You could take all those, tie them together and plug them into the G port if you wanted, but just to save time I leave them there. And then the last thing I do is I plug in the existing system's AC power. So that is one way that you could wire up the takeover module. With programming, because each of those zones are individual zones, each one will be a little different. Your zone type might change. Say zone 1, or sorry, say terminal number 1 is a front door, but then terminal number 2 is a bedroom window. So your zone type will change. Your equipment code will always be the same. It's always going to be the takeover module. And then you've got your serial number. And this is another question we get asked a lot, is how to do the serial number. On the box and on the module, you'll have a 7-digit serial number that'll end with a 1. That serial number is for terminal number 1. So if you look at the module, you've got terminal number 1. You'll use that serial number. For terminals 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, you'll use the same exact serial number, but as you can see in the picture, that last digit changes to be whatever your terminal number is. That's how the panel knows which of those terminals or which of those zones that signal is coming from. And then everything else is just like any of the other wireless zones. You've got, all of these will be a loop 1. You've got your voice descriptor that you can program for each zone. So that is how you program a takeover module. If you have questions on it, let me know. And we can answer those. Now for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to go over some Z-Wave and home services. And some of you might be more familiar with Z-Wave than others. Some of you might be completely new to Z-Wave. So this will be pretty basic. Okay. So what is Z-Wave? Z-Wave is basically it's a wireless network that lets different devices talk to each other. And then you can control those remotely. The nice thing with Z-Wave is that it's simple. You can easily add or remove a device into your network. And it's modular, so you can add devices over time, pretty much whenever you want. And the more devices you add into a network, typically the more robust and the stronger that network will become. It uses the 908 megahertz frequency, and there's some pretty neat things you can do with the Z-Wave. One of the important things is the two-way communication. With the devices, a device can both send and receive a signal, and that's helpful for a couple of reasons. Z-Wave has an open-air line of sight range of about 30 to 40 feet, and if you're outside of that 30 to 40 foot range, those devices aren't going to talk to the controller. So, for example, say you're in a house and you've got a thermostat on the opposite side of the house, or maybe upstairs, and it's 30 to 40 feet line of sight. So if you have to travel through walls, it's going to decrease that distance. So what you can do is you can use a device that'll act as a repeater. You can get some lamp modules that repeat signal, and you can put it about halfway between the controller and the thermostat or whatever the destination device is, and that lamp module will talk to the controller, and then the lamp module will also talk to that thermostat because it's within range. And so then that controller is able to see that device. So what happens is it sets up routing tables and it sets up the network so that the different devices can see each other, and you're able to control your devices that way. And again, the more devices you have in your network, the more reliable it becomes, just because if one device fails, there are other devices that the controller can try and use to talk to whichever devices are out of range. So all of your Z-Wave is done under the Home Services button. But before we can actually go in there, we need to go do some programming real quick. So going back into system configuration, we've got question 79. Question 79 by default will be a 1, and you're going to change it to either a 2 or a 3. And the easy way to know how to do it is by asking if they are using Alarm.com. If the customer is using Alarm.com, then they need to set question 79 as a 3. If they're not using Alarm.com and they're just doing everything locally on the panel and using POTS phone for their dialer, then they need to set question 79 as a 2. So the difference is a 2 allows for, it's locally fully enabled and the remote access is disabled. But setting it as a 3 allows for the remote access or Alarm.com. Now you also have different classes of devices. Every device is going to be placed into a class. Question 80 is for your switches, and the switch is going to be anything that's on or off. Your lamp modules, light switches, things like that. Question 81 is your thermostat control. So if you're going to be using a Z-Wave thermostat. And then question 82 are your door locks. So you'll want to enable those. Oops. And then to add and remove devices, now you can go back to the home screen and we'll click on services and you'll press the toolbox button, which is in the bottom right corner. It'll ask you for your installer code. And then inside the Z-Wave toolbox screen, you have the add and remove devices button. If you click add devices, it'll give you a blank screen that says add Z-Wave devices, discovering devices, and then it'll be blank. And at that point the panel's in a pairing mode, and whatever device you're using, whether it's a light, a lock, a thermostat, each and every Z-Wave device has some type of an inclusion process. A lot of the lamp modules or lighting switches will have a button that you just need to press. Some of them you have to double click. You'll want to read the instructions for that device. Same thing with the locks. Some of the locks will have a little button that you can press. Some of the other locks have a numeric combination that you have to type in. So just whatever that process is for that specific device, you'll do it, and then the device will show up on the panel. At first it'll show that a device is discovered, querying device information, and that just means that it's uploading all that information from that device. Once it's done uploading, it'll then show what type of device it is, who the manufacturer is, and it'll assign it a node or a device number. Same thing when you remove a device. You'll just press remove devices. It'll go into a pairing. It'll start looking for signals, and you just press that pairing button on that device, and it'll remove it from the network. So it's super easy to do. Once you've added a device, you can rename it, and this is helpful because say you have like 5 or 6 light switches, and you want to know where in the house those light switches are. If you click switches, it'll list all of them, and then you can press on the specific device bar, and in the bottom right corner is a rename button, and so you can just press the rename button, relabel it whatever you want it to be, and you can do that with all of your different devices. Now when you get into the automation part, this is where you can get pretty creative, and there's 2 different ways you can do the automation. You can either do it locally on the panel by using the scenes and the rules buttons on the screen, or you can use Alarm.com. I'll show you both. The Alarm.com route is more common just because everybody's starting to use their smartphones. They like the ability to remotely access their panel and do things. But I'll show you both ways just in case you're ever in a house that they're not using Alarm.com. this is what they would do. So you've got scenes and rules, and the difference is a scene is what happens, and a rule is when it'll happen. So you have to create the scene first. So press scenes, press add scene, and label it whatever you want. Lights on, lights off, goodbye, welcome home. Those are two pretty popular ones where you can add multiple things. So just label it whatever you want to happen, and then whatever you want to happen, select that device. So say you want the kitchen light to turn off. We're going to press add action. We're going to press switches, and then we're going to select our kitchen light and turn it off, and then hit the OK button. Some people do the goodbye and the welcome home scenes, and in those scenes you can have it set up so that when you run the goodbye scene, it'll shut off your lights, it'll lower your thermostat, and it'll lock your door. And then the welcome home scene will unlock your door, turn on your lights, and raise your thermostat back to normal. So you can get pretty creative. Once you've got your scene set, then you'll select the rules, and you'll add a rule. And the rules on the panel are event-based. So system armed away, system disarmed, alarms, doors opened or closed, stuff like that. It's a specific event. They're not time-based, just events. So select the event that you want to have happen, and then the scene that it'll run. So when I arm my system in the away mode, it's going to turn off my lights. You can also use it for safety. So say we have a smoke detector or a carbon monoxide detector upstairs. If there's a fire, we can have it set up so that it'll unlock my doors, it'll turn on my lights, and it'll shut off my thermostat altogether. That way we're not circulating smoke through the house. So you can use it for fun stuff, you can use it for safety, but you can be pretty creative with it. Now, when you do the rules on alarm.com, the customer can just log into their alarm.com account, and under the Empower tab, they'll be able to view all their devices. They can control everything, but there'll be a rules tab, and under the rules, they can set up event-triggered rules or scheduled automation. So time of day, 6 p.m. turn my lights on, 6 a.m. turn my lights off, stuff like that. They also just introduced the new sunrise and sunset. So that's what I've got set up. I was sitting in my living room last night watching the basketball game, and my lights turned on because it was sunset. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. You can be pretty creative. And the last thing that we'll go over real quick is the thermostat. And I actually need to change this because we now offer the CT100, which is a little bit of a step up from the CT30. But just for general information, the CT30, it's made by Radio Thermostat. Battery powered or C-wire power, so depending on your HVAC system. If it's battery powered, it'll probably last you about 10 months or so. So hopefully you got a C-wire. The new CT100 is rated at 2 years. Well, 18 months to 2 years. So you got a lot longer battery life on there. But with the wiring, a couple things. First off, you're going to want to make sure your HVAC system is shut off. We don't want to play with any hot wires. But the important thing is to label. There's not a specific color scheme with the wires. So just because it's a red wire doesn't mean it plugs into R, H. Or just because it's a white wire doesn't mean it plugs into W. So make sure that you label those wires based off of where they were plugged into on the existing thermostat. Then you can unplug them all, plug them into your new thermostat, and if you have any questions, there will be a wire diagram that comes with the thermostat. You can also just give us a call. We have an HVAC support here, so if you ever have questions, you can just call in and talk to our HVAC rep. But once it's all wired up and powered up, you can add it into your Z-Wave network. And so you'll just go back in, you'll go through the add devices process, and the thermostat has a two-step process. Step 1 is you press the menu button, and then step 2 is you press the mate button twice. So add devices, menu, mate, and then it'll go through that querying process where it uploads all the information, and then it will be added to your network, and you will be able to control that device either locally on the panel or remotely through alarm.com. Here's all of our contact information. So if you ever have questions, or if any of your techs ever have questions or need help, please give us a call. Our number is 855-2GIG-TECH. It's 855-244-4832. We are open Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Mountain Time. So depending on where you are located, just make sure the time changes. And then on Saturdays, we're open 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Also, here's the phone number for alarm.com and Radio Thermostat. But again, with the thermostat stuff, if you have questions, it's easier to get thermostat answers to questions if you just call our tech support number. So that being said, thanks for attending. Enjoy the day. Again, my name is Andrew Curtis. If you ever have questions or if you ever need something, please feel free to email me or give me a call, and we'll get you taken care of.